Today I wanted to talk about Ron Paul's stance on Iran, which I completely agree with, and it's generally seen as something that's a bit controversial in the mainstream media and political establishment, but I think Ron Paul's non-aggressive, non-interventionist approach to Iran is exactly what our country needs right now. The media and the political establishment have been using the exact same rhetoric to justify launching a preemptive war on Iran that they did to justify invading Iraq back in 2003, and it blows my mind that people are actually falling for this. After 9/11, we all know the Bush administration stressed the imminent threat that Iraq allegedly posed to the United States because they might have weapons of mass destruction. In reality, there were no WMDs. The United States spends billions of dollars a year on intelligence gathering, but we weren't able to figure out whether a country had nuclear weapons or not. So that's something to think about. In my eyes, the government really doesn't have any credibility in providing the public with truthful reasons for going to war. Ron Paul is the only candidate who will not wage war on Iran if elected. I don't want to see more of our men and women go overseas to die in a war that we can't afford and that doesn't have a justifiable cause. The media and political establishment have created Iran to be a much bigger threat to the United States than it actually is. Iran as an enemy to the United States is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Think about this. The United States has almost 9,000 nuclear weapons. Iran has none. Yet we are the ones that need to launch a war. This doesn't make sense. The government and the media want us to believe that Iran is a threat so they can wage a war without much public opposition and expand the U.S. empire. If Iran is threatening to bomb Israel, which is what this argument often goes back to, that is Israel's problem. Israel has at least 300 nuclear weapons, and they're a sovereign nation and can deal with it on their own. If Iran and Israel want to get in a fight with each other, that doesn't mean that the United States has to get involved. Ron Paul said in an interview with Chris Wallace last weekend that we should offer friendship to Iran, and the neocons and warhawks have laughed at this remark, but I think it's a great idea, and it's so sad that we live in a society where we've been conditioned to believe that peace is not a possibility. If we stop trying to tell the rest of the world what to do, we might be looked on more favorably in the international community. Think of how the rest of the world views the United States. It's seriously embarrassing. We march into these countries, we occupy them for years, we try to tell them what to do and how they should live their lives, we take their civilians as collateral damage. This is why the rest of the world does not like us. On this Veterans Day, please take a moment to reflect on all the men and women who have been sent overseas to risk and sacrifice their lives because of our country's blind devotion to war. It's time for all of them to come home. A vote for Ron Paul means a vote for peace and a vote to keep our troops safe.
Congressman Paul, you say that President Obama is not too soft on Iran. You say that he is too tough on Iran. I want to put up some of your statements. Sanctions are not diplomacy, you say. They are a precursor to war and an embarrassment to a country that pays lip service to free trade. As for Iran's nuclear ambitions, you wrote this: one can understand why they might want to become nuclear capable, if only to defend themselves and to be treated more respectfully. Is that your policy towards Iran?
Well, even our own CIA gives me this information that they have no evidence that they're working on a weapon. Just think of what we went through in the Cold War. When I was in the Air Force, after I was drafted in the Air Force, all through the 60s, we were standing up against the Soviets. They had like 30,000 nuclear weapons with intercontinental missiles. Just think of the agitation and the worrying of a country that might get a nuclear weapon someday, and just think of how many nuclear weapons surround Iran. The Chinese are there, the Indians are there, the Pakistanis are there, the Israelis are there, the United States is there, all these countries. China has nuclear weapons. Why wouldn't it be natural that they might want a weapon? There'd be, internationally, they'd be given more respect. Why should we write people off? There was, in the 50s, we at least talked to them. At least our leaders and Reagan talked to the Soviets. What's so terribly bad about this? And countries that you put sanctions on, you are more likely to fight them. I say a policy of peace is free trade, stay out of their internal business, don't get involved in these wars, and just bring our troops home.
Congressman Paul, Congressman Paul, I want to just give you 15 seconds. I want to just make sure I understand. So your policy towards Iran is if they want to develop a nuclear weapon, that's their right, no sanctions, no effort to stop them.
No, I think that makes it much worse. Why would that be so strange if the Soviets and the Chinese have nuclear weapons? We tolerated the Soviets. We didn't attack them, and they were a much greater danger. They were the greatest danger to us in our whole history. But you don't go to war against them. I mean, this whole idea of sanctions, all these pretend free traders, they're the ones who put on these trade sanctions. This is why we still don't have trade relationships with Cuba. It's about time we talk to Cuba and stop fighting these wars that are about 30 or 40 years old.
Mr. Kaine, Senator Santorum, I got a question for you.
Well, as the author of the Iran Freedom Support Act, which he is criticizing, because I authored it when I was in the United States the Senate would actually impose sanctions on Iran because of their nuclear program. Iran is not Iceland, Ron. Iran is a country that has been at war with us since 1979. Iran is a country that has killed more American men and women in uniform in Iraq and Afghanistan than the Iraqis and the Afghanistan has had. The Iranians are the existential threat to the state of Israel. You ask the Israelis, what keeps them up at night? It's the Iranians funding of Hamas and Hezbollah and the support of Syria.
30 seconds.
And the reason, hold on, let me finish.
There are rules here, sir.
Yeah, I know there are rules, and you guys have been giving these guys a lot of time and not a whole lot of time to me, so let me answer the question.
You have a question coming.
Okay. The senator is wrong on his history. We've been at war in Iran for a lot longer than 79. We started it in 1953 when we sent in a coup, installed the Shah, and the reaction, the blowback came in 1979. It's been going on and on because we just plain don't mind our own business. That's our problem.
For most Americans, the story begins in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis. A group of revolutionary university students took over the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 diplomats hostage for 444 days. To help burn this into the American narrative, the news show Nightline was created with a nightly tally of the number of days since the crisis started. But to really understand, we have to go back to 1953, which is where the story begins for most Iranians. This was the year that the U.S. overthrew Iran's democracy and installed the Shah, a pro-U.S. dictator. In 1951, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh was the first elected official who was appointed as Prime Minister of Iran by popular demand. He saw that the wealth needed to build Iran was leaving the country, because over the past 50 years, its vast oil reserves were under British control at the hands of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later to become BP, or British Petroleum. So Mossadegh became hugely popular for nationalizing the oil industry and taking back the oil. Hugely popular at home, but quite unpopular with the British government. Britain took Iran to the World Court over the matter and lost. They tried to hit Iran's economy by blockading the Gulf and halting trade. They tried to convince the U.S. to assist with regime change, but then President Truman was not interested. However, when U.S. President Eisenhower took office in 1953, Britain was able to persuade him under the Cold War pretext that Mossadegh relied on Iran's Communist Party for power. The newly formed CIA was sent to engineer a coup, codenamed Operation Ajax. Iran's monarch, the Shah, returned to power. He had previously been weakened by the new parliament, a short democratic experiment designed to limit his powers. After 1953, he returned fully backed by UK and US power, and the oil was soon flowing under control of Britain, America, the Netherlands, and France. The Shah became increasingly arrogant, opulent, and autocratic over his 25-year rule. He instilled fear in the population with a secret police known as Savak, created by the American CIA and Israeli Mossad, that tortured and imprisoned those who dared to dissent. He crushed all political opposition. Troops were sent to massacre demonstrators. He pushed a white revolution to modernize and westernize the country, giving women the right to vote and other reforms, but ultimately, he served the elites and created a huge economic gap for the poor masses. Powerful religious leaders saw that he was forcibly trying to rid Iran of Islam in a country that was 90% Muslim. One of the Shah's leading critics, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, was arrested and imprisoned for 18 months. After his release in 1964, Khomeini was sent into exile for 14 years. From abroad, he continued his anti-U.S., anti-Shah campaign through sermons on cassette tapes that made their way back into Iran and circulated as people copied and shared them. By the end of the 1970s, things had gotten so bad that major protests and the violence that followed were becoming a regular occurrence. The Shah declared martial law and banned demonstrations. This resulted in a huge protest and a general strike that shut down the economy. Soon over 2 million people flooded a public square in Tehran, demanding to remove the Shah and for Khomeini to return, and that is exactly what happened. One important thing to note is that the CIA orchestrated the 1953 coup out of the very same American embassy in Tehran that was later the site of the hostage crisis, right after the Shah was overthrown by popular revolution in 1979. The students were convinced that once again, the U.S. had plans to overthrow their revolution. In fact, U.S. President Carter did send a NATO general to instigate a military coup, but it failed. Iran and the U.S. had an extradition treaty in force that obligated the Carter administration to return the Shah to Iran as an indicted criminal. The students had 4 demands: return the Shah to Iran for trial. He had been accepted into America for medical treatment. Return the Shah's wealth to the Iranian people. A promise from the U.S. not to interfere in Iran's affairs in the future. And an apology and admission of guilt by the U.S. for its past actions in Iran. The apology never came, but 20 years later, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright did acknowledge the U.S. role in Mossadegh's overthrow. So Khomeini took power in 1979 and instituted a government under Islamic law. Within a year of the revolution, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran without provocation, seeking control of Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan region and key oil shipping waterways. The resulting Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 was the longest and one of the most devastating conventional wars of the century. At least 500,000 Iranians were killed. This war further cemented resentment of the U.S. government, as they were playing both sides. On one hand, they were supporting Iraq, providing money, technology, and intelligence, including satellite photography, to help Iraqi bombing raids. The U.S. helped provide Saddam Hussein with weapons by giving him agricultural credits and pressuring Gulf states to give him billions in loans so he could buy weapons from Western Europe, China, and Russia. The U.S. Department of Commerce issued licenses to export materials for Iraq's weapons of mass destruction program. The U.S. continued its support even after learning that Iraq was using chemical weapons against Iran, not to mention against its own citizens, to stop an uprising of Kurdish separatists. But the imperialist tradition also called for maintaining regional balance of power. So the U.S. also armed Iran, not letting any one regional power get secure enough to dominate or to ally with its neighbors to challenge U.S. hegemony.
Hey, watch out for them Iranians, even though it's coming out as another big lie, you know, from the Gulf of Tonkin, that never happened, that killed 60,000 of our troops, wounded over 300,000 for the Vietnam War, killed millions over there. Even though the big lies of they don't have weapons of mass destruction and ties to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, what this Iranian thing does, you see, Alex, for the people that don't know, they pick up the soundbite, and now they hate the Iranians. So now what they'll do, even if they lose on this one, it's another one under their arm, another piece in the book. So when another false flag comes and they throw another war on us, they'll add up enough to get a lot of the sheeple to follow. Remember,
well, that was my next point. They're already saying... No, you're right. They're already saying that, well, you don't buy this? We've got more fake Iranian stories about to come out.
Exactly. When all else loses, they take you to war. These are sociopaths and psychopaths. You could call them presidents or prime ministers. You could clean it up any way you want. You have to call a spade a spade. These people are sick. They're mass murderers. Can anybody say that line? They're mass murderers. They're killing innocent people for fake reasons.
The U.S.
Same question down the line, gentlemen. It's so important. Congressman Paul, do you believe the president needs authorization of Congress to attack strategic targets in Iran, nuclear facilities?
Absolutely. This idea of going and talking to attorneys totally baffles me. Why don't we just open up the Constitution and read it? You're not allowed to go to war without a declaration of war. Now, as far as fleeting enemies go, yes, if there's an imminent attack on us, we've never had that happen in 220 years. The thought that the Iranians could pose an imminent attack on the United States is preposterous. There's no way. This is just this is just war propaganda. Continued war propaganda, preparing this nation to go to war and spread this war not only in Iraq but into Iran unconstitutionally. It is a road to disaster for us as a nation. It's a road to our financial disaster if we don't read the Constitution once in a while.
Around the horn, Congressman.
Arena known to all here in Durham as the WIT. This round of questions is going to be based on a scenario which we think is quite plausible that any of you as president might well end up facing. It concerns Iran, and these are the circumstances. Its nuclear program has continued to advance. UN weapons inspectors have now saying that it appears that Iran is on the verge of being able to produce and may even be producing nuclear weapons. Iran has suspended its cooperation with the UN nuclear agency and asked the inspectors to leave the country. Cross-border incidents in Iraq involving elements of the Revolutionary Guards have continued to increase and are a continuing problem for U.S. forces there and for the Iraqis as well. The UN Security Council has imposed some economic sanctions on Iran, but has refused to authorize the use of force against that country. In addition, the threats by Iran's leader against Israel have become more pronounced and more extreme. What do you do? Congressman Paul.
For one thing I would remember very clearly is the president doesn't have the authority to go to war. He goes to the Congress.
So what do you do?
He goes to the Congress and finds out if there's any threat to our national security. And thinking back to the 1960s when I was in the Air Force for 5 years, and there was a Cold War going on, and the Soviets had 40,000, and we stood them down, and we didn't have to have a nuclear confrontation, I would say that we should go very cautiously. We should back off. We should be talking to Iran right now. We shouldn't be looking for the opportunity to attack them. They are, at the present time, according to the AEIA, cooperating, and by the end of the year, they're supposed to be willing to reveal all that they are doing. So instead of looking for this scenario where it is inevitable that we have to attack, I think we ought to be talking about how do you get along with some people that are deadly, like the Soviets and the Chinese and the many others. We don't have to resort to war every single time there's a confrontation. They are not a threat to Israel. Israel has 200 or 300 nuclear missiles, and they can take care of themselves. So you shouldn't assume that we have to jump in and go to war, and we certainly shouldn't do it without the consent of the Congress.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
The war had been planned in Iraq many, many years before it happened. Matter of fact, the declaration of war, essential declaration, was the Iraqi Liberation Act in 1998. That was when the Congress voted on a bill that said we will have regime change. And unfortunately, very similar resolutions have been passed already in Iran. If anything, I would like to make sure that we don't needlessly go to war against Iran.
Amen. Rationality, not idealism. Rationality, not idealism.
Solve the problems that we're having in Iraq if you were president. What would be your first step in our office?
Well, the very first thing I would do to sort of soften things, what's going on there, within minutes, you could at least tell our aircraft carriers to start moving away from the shorelines of Iran, yelling and screaming and intimidating them. We have surrounded Iran now. We're getting ready to go to war against them, unfortunately. We're in a country to the east and a country to the west, and we're in the ocean intimidating them. And I think just move the ships back a little.
Would you bring the troops home?
Bring the troops home, certainly.
Bring them home! Bring them home! Bring your troops home!
You know, it said that if we set a timetable for bringing the troops home, that they'll sit out and wait us. That's called a ceasefire. And I think the sooner they know that we are going to leave whenever it's reasonable, that there'll be a ceasefire, and they may even talk to each other. Maybe they'll come up with something. Just think how much peace there's been in Vietnam since we left. Million Vietnamese, 60,000 of our men died in Vietnam. So when we leave, what do? We invest in them and we trade, and they're more westernized than ever. The founders were absolutely right on this issue, that if you talk with people and friends with people and trade with people, we're much better off than trying to impose our will on them. This actually didn't start with this administration, nor the previous administration. This has been smoldering for about 100 years. It was Woodrow Wilson that said, we as great Americans will make the world safe for democracy. And look at what's happened since World War.
I want to switch to another angle of the war on terror, though if you want to weigh in on Iran, feel free. You say that we don't win the war on terror by closing Guantanamo and reading Miranda rights to terrorists. Congressman Paul says terrorism suspects have committed a crime and are should be given due process in civilian courts. Could you please tell Congressman Paul why he's wrong?
Well, because simply terrorists who commit acts against United States citizens, people who are from foreign countries who do that, do not have any right under our Constitution to Miranda rights. We've also seen that Guantanamo Bay has yielded significant information. In fact, we've learned that that led to the capture and the killing of bin Laden. This is a tool that we need to have in order to be able to prosecute the new type of war, the new type of warfare, and the new type of terrorists that this country is dealing with. Regarding Iran, Iran is the central issue in the Middle East and their capacity to become a nuclear power. They are one of the 4 state sponsors of terror in the world. I sit on the House Select Committee on Intelligence. I can't reveal classified information, but I can say this. As President of the United States, I will do everything to make sure that Iran does not become a nuclear power.
30 seconds, Congressman Paul.
Well, I think she turns our rule of law on its head. She says that the terrorists don't deserve protection under our courts, but therefore a judgment has to be made. They're ruled a terrorist. Who rules them a terrorist? I thought our courts recognized that you had to be tried, and we've done this. And we've brought individuals back from Pakistan and other places. We've given them a trial in this country. Over 300, or at least near 300, we tried and put them in prison. So this idea that we have to turn on its head and reject the rule of law, we already are at the point where this administration, please let me finish. I have to say, this administration already has accepted the principle that when you assume somebody is a terrorist, they can be targeted for assassination, even American citizens. That affects all of us eventually. You don't want to translate our rule of law into a rule of mob rule.
Senator Santorum. Senator Santorum, I want to pick up on this debate. You say Attorney General Holder must be under the influence, and in fact you've suggested perhaps smoking mushrooms, to want to try terrorists in civilian court. Are you also suggesting that Congressman Paul is under the influence?
Well, anyone that suggests that Iran is not a threat to this country or is not a threat to stability in the Middle East is obviously not seeing the world very clearly. He sees it exactly the way that Barack Obama sees it, that we have to go around and apologize for the fact that we've gone out and exerted our influence to create freedom around the world. I don't apologize for that. I don't apologize for the Iranian people being free for a long time, and now they're under a malocracy that tramples the rights of women, tramples the rights of gays, tramples the rights of people all throughout their society, and is the greatest supporter of terrorism in the Middle East and around the world, and is setting up training camps and is working with Venezuela and other countries in our south of our border to threaten us. Iran is a country that must be confronted. I was in front of this curve. I authored the Iran Freedom Support Act back in 2004. It was blocked by Joe Biden, nonetheless, and Barack Obama once. We got it passed, and I can tell you, if Rick Santorum and when Rick Santorum is president, Iran will not get a nuclear weapon, because the world as we know it will be no more.
Congressman Paul, 30 seconds.
You've heard the war propaganda that is liable to lead us into the sixth war, and I worry about that position. Iran is a threat because they have some militants there, but believe me, they're all around the world, and they're all around the world, and they're not a whole lot different than others. Iran does not have an air force that can come here. They can't even make enough gasoline for themselves. And here we are, building this case out, please. They're building up this case just like we did in Iraq. Build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they had nuclear weapons, and we had to go in. I'm sure you supported that war as well. Yeah. Okay. It's time we quit this. It's time. It's trillions of dollars we're spending on these wars.
Job. Thank you. In light of the big needs and the financial realities we've just discussed up to this point, realistically, what do you believe you could accomplish in your first year as president? Thank you. That's a tall order for a year. Congressman Paul, what about you?
Well, there's a limit to what you can do in 1 year, and at home it's more difficult. You would have to work with the Congress, but a commander-in-chief could end the war. We could bring our troops home. That would be a major event. It would be very valuable. We could be we could become diplomatically credible once again around the world. Right now, today, we're not. Even our allies resent what we do. We would have no more preemptive war. We would threaten nobody. We would not threaten Iran. Now that it is proven once again, Iraq didn't have the nuclear weapon, had nothing to do with 9/11. The Iranians have no nuclear weapon, according to our CIA. There's no need for us to threaten the Iranians. We could immediately turn the Navy around and bring them home, and I think this would be a major step toward